If this looks a bit fuzzy and odd, it's because I've swapped the cameras. So instead of taking the video with this one and reading off of the shitty screen, I'm going to take the video with the shitty one and read off the nice screen. So hopefully that will result in a little bit better listening experience. So I'm going to continue on with installment number 2 of Stephen's book. Stephen, I'm not sure what Stephen is doing, but one of the things that he's not doing is editing the next section so I can read it, which is alright, because maybe it's better in rough draft anyway, since I'm not reading flawlessly anyway, stumbling over words here and there. I might try and edit a bit as I'm reading, but not gonna do that too much. So anyway, this is installment 2. I'm gonna do this in half-hour segments and see how that goes. I don't know how long that will take, but that's how we're gonna go about it. So this is book 1. Well, whatever it is, I forgot the title of it. There's 3 sections, and this is the first section. I slid my way out from under the bed backwards, wiggling my torso like an eel. I had become quite good at this legless and armless form of movement. I knew my mother would be back here in a few minutes to tell me that supper was ready, and I couldn't let her see me under the bed. It was my secret. It was my fortress of solitude. I sat on top of my bed and feigned interest in some homework, waiting tentatively for my mother's approach. Sure enough, I could hear her walking up to my bedroom with slow, dignified, tipsy steps. This was the stage of my mother's drunkenness that I referred to as Princess Alcoholic. This level was one of the earlier stages of the night, preceded by humorous tipsy mother and followed by loudmouth, stupid woman, and finally the mean queen, which was the last stage of her daily alcoholic mitosis. Princess Alcoholic was by far the most harmless stage of her night, but the most annoying by a long shot. When she was like this, she always acted as if she was a descendant of Southern aristocracy. She spoke with well-punctuated, short sentences, each served on a fake paper doily. Supper was always the most interesting with Princess Alcoholic. She stood at my doorway, her curly brown hair down around her shoulders. Her springy bangs bounced as she knocked on the door frame, obviously one of her princess courtesies I was rarely afforded. She was a pretty woman, especially when she wore her dress with the large golden sunflowers, which she was wearing that night. She had her hands on her hips, and I could tell that her lips and her brain were debating the proper way to ask me to come and sit down at the dinner table. "Jacob, it is time to eat, honey. You need to go and get cleaned up and come sit with me and Mr. Riley. I fixed a roast." She walked away before I could reply, as she often did. My mother and I never really shared words. We just tossed lonely fragments at each other and hoped for the best. We kept ourselves oblivious to each other's lives. That's how we felt comfortable, separated by an impersonal silence, perfect strangers. I washed my hands and walked into the kitchen. With a large wooden spoon, my mother shoveled out burnt beef and spooned it gently onto Mr. Riley's paper plate and then my own. I sat facing the wall and my mother and her lover sat opposite one another so they could gawk at each other over their meals. We all began plucking away the edible bits of meat from the roast, and I listened to Mr. Riley smack. I'd never known my family to say grace before a meal. My mother restrained her bad manners when she was Princess Alcoholic, and she very neatly folded her paper towel over her lap and cut her roast into small symmetrical cubes as best she could with her plastic knife and fork. She made comments about the recipe she had used this time and how she had finally perfected the preparation of her roast. It tasted just like it always did to me, burnt. But food is food. I ate. I tried to study my mother, decipher the secret codes sealed away inside of her, unravel the mystery behind her existence, and find the secret character she'd hidden under her alcoholism. But I can never bring myself to look at her for more than a few seconds at a time. Something about watching her as she watched Mr. Riley made me feel inadequate. He was such a terrible man, and yet she found more satisfaction in pleasing him than she did her own son. Sometimes I felt insignificant, but I hid that from my mother and I hid it from myself. My youth was a lonely pact of solidarity and lacked inner reflections and in-depth personal study. That's what drove the daydreams and the nightmares. I glanced at Mr. Riley. He caught my eyes, and it felt as if he grabbed my spine with his mind, sending shivers up and down my back and leaving goose flesh all over my arms. Mr. Riley was a man that never quite grew up and never stopped being a bully. He was one of those playground terrors that stalked children. He was always a big man, and I imagine he had been a big adolescent as well. He was at least 6'5", 300 pounds, and his arms were full of knotted, rocky muscles that weren't defined in any way, just thick and powerful like the limbs of an old tree. He always wore tight, paint-splattered, greasy blue jeans and work t-shirts with a permanent rectangle shape in the chest pocket from the pack of cigarettes he kept there. He worked hard and long. His skin was dark, tanned from many hours on the shadeless, hell-hot blacktops of the runways. He worked on planes at the local airfield for a living, although his wife largely supported him financially. He was a mechanic and recovered antique aircrafts at his wife's expense. I never knew why he chose to be the master of planes. He seemed like a truck guy to me. Planes were just so free, unbridled and floating, lifted from the restriction of 2 dimensions. As a child, I dreamt of flying, soaring over the clouds and above the trees just like a hawk. Mr. Riley was not a man I could picture flying. I just couldn't picture him letting go of reality enough to actually soar. Soar. Know what I mean? You have to have a certain innocent glow to your spirit in order to have dreams like that. Eagle dreams. Why would he specialize in something so much unlike himself? Beelzebub. Lord of those that fly rapidly, from place to place. His passion was machines, and he loved them completely. He was their master, their doctor, and their creator, and he loved having power over his machines. To the airfield and its employees, he was the Almighty. I suppose that's why he loved both his wife and my mother. They were both easy to manipulate, just 2 more contraptions operating under his control. But Mr. Riley needed his wife for her untold riches. She was famously wealthy. Her name was well known in political and social circles. She owned his blacktop. She held the title of all his vehicles, both aerial and terrestrial. She even supplied him with his coffin nails, which he was totally reliant on. Her ancestors had been British loyalist landowners that made their fortune in tobacco. I remember on several occasions his wife calling over to the house and my mother answering the telephone. Mrs. Riley never got mad. She would just ask her husband to please come home. I suspect that she was a sad woman, a lonesome woman, and I often hated my mother intensely for that. My mother loved having his attention, and it made her feel good to know that she was often chosen over his own millionaire wife. It made her feel pretty, important, and powerful. The whore of Babylon. The rumble of a slow boiling argument stirred in my ears. My mother and Mr. Riley snapping at each other across the dinner table, but I chose to ignore it and submerge myself in a daydream about two flying fish. I was suddenly thrown back into reality by Mr. Riley reaching over table and slapping my mother hard across the face. I jumped in my seat at the gunshot sound, but quickly resumed eating and stared at the wall like I had done before, pretending that nothing happened. This was a common piece of dinner theater. My mother feigned shock, but the humiliation in her face as she looked down at her plate was real. I didn't even need to look at her to recognize her expression. It was burnt into my memory like deep napalm scars that would never go away. "Don't you ever say that to me again, woman. I'm not your goddamned ex-husband. You hear me, woman?" I had no idea what the fight was over. It was always something insignificant and pointless. I think Mr. Riley did this periodically to reaffirm his manhood and his dominance in my mother's house, like an alpha male chimp would do in his tribe. He said the word woman as if it was a derogatory title to hold. I always found women beautiful, beautiful and unattainable. That night I was feeling rather rash, bold and full of supernatural childhood courage. So I decided, right in the heat of their argument, to sit up, push back my chair, and attempt to walk away from the scene that was unfolding. As soon as my butt left the seat, his hand was on my arm, and I was yanked back with a force that nearly dislocated my shoulder. "Don't treat me like I'm your mother, boy. When you are in my house, I make the rules, and I say when you can get up from the dinner table," he said to me in that dangerous devil voice he possessed when he was drunk. "This isn't your house," I whispered. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. It just leapt from my mouth like a Mustang over a tall fence, beautiful and unexpected. Small though they were, these words were power to me. This brilliant flash of my soul's strength was cut short by his palm catching the curve of my cheek. "Don't you talk to me that way. A boy's mouth is supposed to stay shut until he is man enough to back up his big words, you understand? This is my house because I say it's my house, and when you're man enough to lick me, you can call it your house. Until then, it's my goddamned house, you hear me?" I was quiet. "I said, you hear me?" I nodded softly and looked down at the destroyed cow in front of me, ashamed to be so small and so helpless. "And another thing, Sheila, I want some potatoes next time you cook this shit, got it?" I'm not sure if she nodded or not. Our heads were both hung in defeat. His dominance was asserted in the tribe. Some amount of time went by before I could leave the table, and by then they were already over their fight, laughing and flirting the way they did. Alcohol and pain pills did that to people, made them act funny. I went to look in the bathroom mirror to examine the new bruise he had given me. It was red and puffy in the shape of his hand, and it stung when I touched it. It was Sunday night, so I only had a few hours to decide what excuse I was going to tell my teachers this time. It didn't matter. I was just too embarrassed to care about lies just then. I would wait until tomorrow morning. Right now, it was time to retreat to my bed fortress, another battle lost. It was time to write in my notebooks and plot my escape from this hell I had been thrown unwillingly into. I was under my bed before I realized that I had moved instinctively like a fox to his den. My notebook was out. My favorite kind of writing was free-flow writing, just letting my pen drag across the paper and make sentences of unformed, streaming ideas. Streams. I wrote about my father. He was not much like Mr. Riley. He was a proud man that smelled of cologne and had neatly combed blonde hair. He had thick, strong, soft hands and sky blue eyes. People told me I looked just like him, especially my eyes, but his hair was darker and thinner. He had a mustache across his face for most of my childhood, but shaved it shortly after it began to turn gray, saying that it made him look like an old man. I thought it made him look dignified. He worked at Riverbanks Zoo and specialized in birds of all kinds. He cleaned their nests, tended to the hatchlings, and nursed the injured and sick back to health. I recalled a large falcon that had a broken wing. Some teenager had thrown a rock and wounded the poor creature. My father tried to mend its wound, but the break wouldn't set. It died very slowly and very painfully. That was the first of only 3 times I'd ever seen my father cry. I hoped that one day he would come for me, that he might rescue me. My mother wouldn't ever let me talk to him, though. She called him the devil. She wouldn't even let me call him on the phone. I climbed from under my bed, and after neatly stacking my notebook on top of all the others, I struggled to get into my sheets and rested my throbbing cheek on the soft down pillow. I drifted off to sleep with a vision of my father catching Mr. Riley's hand before he struck me. With effort, I smiled, and then I drifted off to sleep. Silent, warm, and perfect. The dreams came as they always did. It is Friday the 13th, and I'm in the Swiss Alps. The stinging snow buzzes past the open cave, and an orange glow from within smears the white wind with color. The trees are blanketed and waving. The ground is bitter and frozen. Everything is serene and natural, unharmed by human hand. A tattered white banner displays a lone black cross. Quite suddenly, a large silver airplane with red propellers miraculously lands on the top of the mountain, flying through the terrible weather. From its cabin, a tall, tan giant with a leather coat and a cowl of sheepskin over his groin emerges. He holds a 2-headed peacock in his hand, like a child with a ladybug. He curls his large fingers around the bird and hides it behind his back. He walks, bent over, into the cave, making small tremors with every step, knocking the snow off the trees, and the wind falls still. The giant approaches an old bearded wise man who sits on a log beside a small fire. A drip of water clings to his old lips. The giant holds his hand behind his back, gently squeezing the peacock with all 12 of his digits. Okay, wise man. If you're wise, tell me whether the peacock in my hand is alive or dead. He draws out 2 fingers from behind his back and extends a long, beautiful feather toward the wise man as proof of the bird's existence. If I say the bird is alive, you will crush it. If I say otherwise, you will show me the bird unscathed. The wise man catches the tan giant in his trick. And so the giant throttles the sage of the mountaintop. The wise man whispers as the life is strangled out of him. The words float as if on a gentle wind. His words sail right into my soul. He sees me clearly. I'm like Enoch, your brother, your past. I'm before and I'm again in all things living. The peacock flies away, alive after all, beautiful feathers of all colors swimming through the air. Chapter 1. From Jacob to Israel, Chapter 2, Book 1. Chapter 2, Monday. The dreaded alarm clock buzzer. I slipped back into reality. I'd forgotten that the giant had 12 fingers, and it wasn't until much later that I realized that it was an airplane with a red propeller that brought the giant to the wise man's protective cave. It was a typical morning. I got out of bed, brushed my teeth, put on a pair of bleach-splattered blue jeans, a red and white striped shirt, and my dirty, falling-apart sneakers. Without a bite of breakfast, I grabbed my book bag and headed out the door of our trailer and began walking to the bus stop. Mondays were always mildly cool this time of year. The sun hit the horizon at such an angle that the trees were huge umbrellas for the dew to grow under. The soft grass of the various fields near my house captured droplets of water from the heavy air, and when the light caught them, they turned into diamonds. Millions of little crystals on green daggers. These fields of bright gems sat juxtaposed to shady thickets, so that the whole world seemed to be contrasting chessboard squares, made light and dark by sun and shadows. A low gray fog poured out onto the road. Since I was born here, I neglected the inherent beauty of the land. I only saw the ugly parts of the South, the parks. As I walked down the cracked emergency lane of Highway number 6, I saw trailer after trailer of all shapes, colors, and sizes, crammed together like a Lego collection thrown onto a dirty floor. Their untended yards were mass graves for the yawning dead bodies of rusted-out pickup trucks. Every yard was covered in weeds, in a quiet so complete it was almost loud. It made me shiver to walk by them. In the distance, dogs barked like always, and I began to run to the bus stop, imagining that a dog was right on my heels. I never looked back until I was at the bus stop. I was always out of breath and sweaty when the bus came to pick me up. As the tires rolled to a stop, I was so wrapped up in a daydream about fighting off herds of dogs with a samurai sword that I completely forgot about my swollen face. The bus was loud and filled with the grime of children. Its seats were brown and covered with graffiti. I quickly remembered my face as I walked to my seat in the back of the bus, surrounded by speculative whispers and sideways stares. I sat down and covered my face with my book bag. My best friend, Thubten, was sitting by the window beside me. He had shaggy dark hair, and his face was long, golden, and slightly Asian. He had the eyes of an old soul. Thubten was small, but he had inner strength. He patted my back gently when he saw the bruise across my face. Thubten was the most amazing person I had met up to that point. He was 16, a year older than me, and in the 10th grade. He rubbed my shoulder, and a calm entered me that pushed away all of the embarrassment. Thubten was half Tibetan, half Irish. He was raised under the Mahayana Buddhist philosophy in South Carolina, which was utterly unheard of. I had never met anyone who was Buddhist, and I wouldn't again until I left this place. I did this thing where I pictured auras around people. Every person gave off a different color that corresponded to their attitude, personality, and maybe even their soul. Thubden had a white aura, a clean aura, like Pastor Casey. "What happened to you?" he asked me. "I've got a nasty bruise too. Dad accidentally dropped a 15-pound battery on my leg. I guess he was trying to make me feel better. My mother's boyfriend hit me last night at dinner because I said our house wasn't his. That's not a good reason to hit anyone. It isn't his house after all. He shouldn't hit you like this, Jacob," Thubden said in a kind, cautious whisper so no one could hear. Thubden pulled his tape player out of his book and popped in Disintegration, a Cure album. He handed me the headphones so I could listen to it for a while. He knew it cheered me up. Billy Corgan and Robert Smith saved my life in high school. Being a freshman was hard, but I had grown up with all of my classmates, and having grown used to my oddities, most of them left me to my own devices. Thubden didn't have a hard life, and I often wondered why he listened to these anthems of despair and far-off hope. Most of the rest of us were too poor to buy tapes, and his parents were supportive of his creative outlets. They let him have money every month to spend at the record shop. I was listening to Fascination Street as we pulled onto Brandon's Road. I smiled at Thubden. I gave him a hug, and he hugged me back, reaffirming that he was always there for me. Some girls a few streets up gawked at us as we held one another. He made things feel much lighter, easier to walk with. He just helped me through life, a soul friend. Our bus stopped and the door creaked open. They needed to be oiled badly. The whole bus was falling apart, and it was in the shop every other week for some reason. But this bus was our second home, and our group was fiercely territorial of its back seats. Brandon walked onto the bus, his black aura sagging like a cloud ready to pour. He headed towards the back and sat across the aisle from Thubden and I. "What are you listening to?" I didn't hear him, but Thubden answered for me. "The Cure." "Which album?" "Disintegration." He nodded disinterestedly and put on his own headphones. The muffled blare of Metallica's Justice for All thumping from his headphones was the closest he came to sharing his music. He didn't want to invite us into his internal world of aggression. I never asked Brandon himself, but Thubden told me in secret that there was a scar on his stomach, where his father tried to do something horrible to him when he was younger. He apparently had surgery and almost died. His father is still in jail for it to this day. We respected his solitary reverie, letting the speed and force, the energy and violence of the sound heal him. Brandon was a large black boy, much larger than I was. He was in the 10th grade with Thubden, but he was much taller and thicker than other boys his age. He approached 6'4" and looked as if he would break any scale he stood on. He wore Jinkos and big black band t-shirts. Today it was Slayer. His shoes were old, very old. They were covered in holes and stitched up, but one of his toes still stuck out. I could tell by the way he walked that they were much too small for his growing feet, but he never complained. He just bottled up the discomfort and tucked it away with his anger and frustration. And there it is, folks. Installment number 2. Hope you enjoy. Give Steven some love. Steven Schitzo Lawson.